There's a story we tell about disease in the early colonial period. It runs something like this. Europeans brought with them new diseases like smallpox, to which the Native Americans had no natural immunity, and 90% of them died as a result. There are many different versions of this story, with different emphasis and subtlety, but by and large we can consider this the standard account. What can we say about the standard account? Firstly, quickly, obviously, we can say that it is a gross oversimplification. This is to be expected. Popular culture derides nuance as weakness. The free market of ideas is a lie simpletons use to comfort themselves, their delusions of freedom obscuring their monistic enslavement to Newcomb's razor. Wow, that's a lot of words. Too bad I'm not reading them. The common cliché that in the free market the cream will rise to the top ignores the fact that if you leave a bowl of milk out in the sun without regulating, it will just spoil. Or, to quote Hemingway, the scum also rises. So, what does the standard account oversimplify? Well, whenever you hear somebody say, the Native Americans did, believed, practiced X, Y, and Z, you know that they're talking out of their hat right away. It requires continual reinforcement that we are not a monolith. There are over 30 language families in North America alone. The only factor that unites the Native Americans across these two continents is that we've got brown skin and we were colonized. Everything else is different. So whenever someone brings up the phrase Native Americans did, practiced, believed, had X, Y, and Z, they're necessarily talking in such broad strokes that any evidence they can bring forward is going to have 100 counterexamples against it. And so any specifics that they bring forward, for example the 90% death statistic, can be immediately discounted. Maybe the Bokononians did have a 90% death rate from smallpox. The Piegan Blackfoot did not. The tired cliché that if you've seen one Indian, you've seen them all goes all the way back to the 1700s in Antonio Aloha and has been repeated by many famous and influential people since then. We are under no obligation to share their opinion. Moving swiftly on, the next problem with our standard account is that it presents smallpox as a sort of lone gunman. In reality, many indigenous people were hit by a variety of diseases in rapid succession. Smallpox, yes, but also bubonic plague, typhus, and others, varying by region. Again, the tendency to oversimplify for the disinterested public is as understandable as it is inexcusable. Presenting the Great Dying, registered trademark, as the product of a single disease paints a very different picture compared to the reality. What else? Where does the old 90% come from? It doesn't come from epidemiologists, nor even from your average Joe doing a simple head count. It comes from conquistadors and Puritans, locked in deadly crusade, looking around after the fog of war clears and realizing that there aren't very many Indians left to shoot. 90% is not a disease mortality statistic, it's a war mortality statistic. In New France, where colonialism mostly occurred without conquest, we have more accurate statistics provided by the Jesuit missionaries. Generally speaking, the first wave of smallpox took between a quarter at the minimum and 2/3 at the maximum. Sagamapi was a Plains Cree who married into the Piegan Blackfoot. His people first encountered smallpox prior to European contact. He remembers that it took about 1/3 of his people. These are still high numbers, but they paint a meaningfully different picture from the standard account. Let's state this again just to reinforce it. It's meaningfully different to say diseases like smallpox killed 90% of Indians, compared to saying the first wave smallpox epidemic generally took about 1/3. As egregious as these are, they are at least recognized as such by the adequately educated. Far more pernicious than the obvious inaccuracies of trite cliché are those that go unnoticed, unquestioned, unchecked, those that have transcended cliché and have entered the realm of that which is known to be known. Europeans brought with them new diseases like smallpox, to which Native Americans had no natural immunity, and 90% of them died as a result. What else is wrong here? No natural immunity. What do they mean by that? It's obvious what they think they mean, that it was a first-wave epidemic smiting new ground. But what is specifically intended by the invocation of the no natural immunity chant? We can answer this by the counterspell of the rhetorical question, Why don't we talk about major European epidemics in the same way? Have you even once encountered the same cliché as our standard account in reference to the Black Death? European traders brought with them foreign diseases such as bubonic plague to which the Europeans had no natural immunity and 70% of them died as a result. Have you ever seen no natural immunity in reference to Europeans? And yet the phrase and its variants are nearly ubiquitous in reference to indigenous people. It's rare to read an article that mentions disease which excludes the phrase. Why? A related question. What concrete evidence do people like Jared Diamond put forward for their no natural immunity virgin soil hypothesis? They make arguments, sure, I've read them, maybe even logical arguments every now and again. Logical arguments are not evidence. Ultimately, no natural immunity, whatever people might specifically intend by this, has nothing more substantial to back it up than intuitive assertions by experts. Worse, the claims put forward are not even of a scientific nature. There's no way that you could test for this. There's no way that you could falsify it or verify it. It's of a religious nature. In this case, how am I to argue against it except by treating it as a religious matter? Hitchen's razor, that which is presented without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. I'll take a little bit more of a moderate approach. Adherents are welcome to believe whatever the heck they want, but that's not a reason why I should believe the same. How did the meme, no natural immunity, achieve its ubiquitous status in the absence of any concrete evidence to support it? Well, unfortunately, it's part of a larger trend. Professor Roland Christian coined a useful phrase, the broken Indian model, which is a name for one of the dominant modes by which the general public understands indigenous issues. Under the broken Indian model, all things which pain the Indian must, clearly, originate from some internal flaw within the Indian, and external factors can be safely ignored. It's not poor, innocent colonialism's fault that the Indians are having a hard time. Those poor, defenseless residential schools are being made a scapegoat when the real culprit is those no-good, thrifty genes. See my separate hour-long lecture on that kettle of worms. Far from being a harmless cliché, no natural immunity is another manifestation of the broken Indian model. It's not that this was a bloody, frightening disease and the leading cause of death in Europe at the time. It's not that they were hit with several diseases of comparable magnitude. It's not people were being threatened with land theft and enslavement, had their livelihoods disrupted. No, none of that could possibly have had anything to do with it. The colonists, the conquistadors, the slavers, they were blameless. It's just that those Indians have bad immune systems, probably due to those no-good thrifty genes. Most other examples of the broken Indian model have been made visible and have received a certain degree of pushback. It's no longer fashionable to attribute poverty-related comorbidities to the Indians' obvious inherent subhumanity, but no natural immunity remains in use even in spaces that fancy themselves politically correct. The rough edges have been worn off through long use, and the phrase passes without friction, unrecognized for the racism it contains. To make myself absolutely clear, it's not racism to suggest that a new illness would strike harshly. The racism is in the double standard. Examine your words. Why is our epidemic implicitly attributed to weak immune systems while your Black Death is not? The actual evidence put forward for both claims is identical. Why for mine but not for thine? The rhetoric out of the way, let's paint a more complicated picture of epidemics. To start, let's talk about virgin soil epidemics by imagining a village of 100 people. We'll make this village a spherical cow and say that there are an even distribution of ages throughout and that every year someone is born and someone else dies. Let's also imagine a disease. It's not very dangerous, but it's very contagious. If it enters a region, it will infect everyone without exception. However, you can only get this disease once in your lifetime. The disease enters our village. Everyone is infected. This epidemic had a 100% infection rate. 50 years pass, the disease comes back through, but now half the village has already had it and can't be reinfected. So the second wave only had a 50% infection rate. It comes back 4 years later, it only has a 4% infection rate. What has changed between these events? Have immune systems gotten stronger? Has this village developed a natural immunity? Has the disease gotten weaker? Has the overall infection rate changed? No, the numbers are the same, they're just spread out. Taking immune differences out of the equation entirely, we see that an endemic disease simply cannot hit as hard as a virgin soil epidemic on a purely numerical basis. Let's make the situation a little more complicated and say that the disease now has a 30% mortality rate. But maintaining our sphere, let's also say that this isn't enough to suppress population levels on a century-long basis. The epidemic will now take 30 people from all demographics, a sizable chunk of the populace at once. This will have major social impact. Many of these people will be visible, known, depended on, loved, making life harder in general for the survivors. Whereas in the village where it's endemic, it will mostly take children, because most of the adults will have already weathered the disease in their youth. Here, the disease will not act as a sudden population dip, but as a steady tax, a barrier that children will just have to get past in order to become adult human beings. Children are also the least visible, least connected, least immediately useful members of society. So here again, despite the overall infection and death statistics remaining the same, we see that the endemic disease is going to be seen and felt as lesser. Let's add another layer of complexity. Because of the distributions, the epidemic disease is necessarily going to have a higher mortality rate than the endemic. This doesn't need to have anything to do with the internal determinant. It's based solely on material reactions. If a subset of a population is laid low by disease, there are going to be other people available who can take up the slack, provide food, water, and care during their convalescence. Having someone to look after you when you're ill will obviously improve your chances. We compare the epidemic village. If everyone is sick at once, there will be no one to serve as caregivers. This will increase mortality, not merely from the disease, but from all causes. To repeat, an epidemic will always have a higher death rate than endemic. That's a sociological matter, not an immunological one. All-cause mortality goes up during an epidemic, because if everybody's sick at once, life gets harder. Have you ever looked into smallpox epidemics in European colonies? In 1702, there was a smallpox epidemic in New France, centered around Quebec City and Montreal. Almost half of all people in New France were infected. More than 2,000 French Canadians died, mostly in urban areas. About a tenth of the population of New France. Quotation. The sickness had started with the house where he, the Iroquois, had stayed, and spread in little time with incredible fury. No house was spared in the city. Those who remained healthy were too few to mind the sick. Entire families were hit by this evil, and the little care they received, along with the infectiousness and malignancy of the plague, made them die quite promptly. Mortality was so great that the priests could not suffice to bury the dead and assist the dying. Every day bodies were carried to the church of the lower city or to the cathedral without any ceremony, and in the evening they were buried, sometimes up to 15, 16, 17, 18 at a time. This went on for several months, so that the death registers counted more than 2,000 dead in Quebec, not mentioning the surrounding rural areas which did not enjoy a better fate. The physicians were baffled. How could it be this bad? It was never like this in Paris, where the disease was just a constant part of life. Over there it was just a children's disease, and sure, it took a fifth of all children, but they were easily replaced. How on earth could it be so insignificant over there and so devastating over here? Quotation. This sickness, which in France is not so nasty and which at the most kills but a few children, was so cruel in this country that it removed a great number of persons of all ages from one end of the colony to the other. Well, what had happened was that the population of New France was too small and too rural to sustain endemic smallpox. Quebec City was at this time only about 2,000 people. That's about the same size as Onondaga Village. So, when the disease came to New France, it would burn itself out pretty quickly, as is the nature of highly lethal diseases. As a consequence of this, there were whole generations of French Canadians who had never been exposed, and, surprise, surprise, these made up the bulk of victims. A historian compiled the death records he was able to find, cross-referenced them with age and place of birth. Good on him, that must have been tedious work. See this table. Note the ratio of children to adults and the ratio of Canadiens to Frenchmen. This is exactly what I would expect to see based on my thought experiments prior. Frenchmen are much less likely to die from smallpox because Paris had over 500,000 people and smallpox never slept. Most of the French immigrants would have already had smallpox as children. Almost everyone in Europe would have contracted it at some point prior. Those who had escaped it would be very rural and isolated. If memory serves, immigrants were a little less than half of the population of New France at the time. This makes sense with regards to half of New France contracting the disease. And the same explanation goes for the adults and children disparity. The adults, by virtue of existing longer, have a higher chance of having already contracted smallpox at some point. It's all just bloody survivor's bias. Exactly the same thing happened in Iceland in 1707. The population of Iceland wasn't large enough or dense enough to sustain endemic smallpox. They reached the point where the vast majority of their population had never contracted smallpox as children. In the span of a single year, out of their population of about 50,000, somewhere between 12 and 18,000 people died of the disease. So what's that? That's somewhere between like 25 and 40%? It's actually worse than this because, according to the statistics I have on Wikipedia, over 30,000 people were infected. That's not 50,000. So if we're going to trust the Wikipedia statistics, this disease had between 1/3 and 2/3 mortality rate. Exactly the bloody same as what was happening over in North America. Why didn't the Icelanders' long association with animals protect them from this? I'm sure one could find other examples of this sort of stuff happening among the colonies and elsewhere, but let's move on. The broken Indian model in all of its manifestations helps to reaffirm the simulacrum of the Indian, which akin to Said's Oriental has little to do with the real, a mere reflection of that which the beast desires us to be, and which, through the monopolization of representation, so generates. The broken Indian model attempts to apply a veneer of scientific objectivity to prejudice, and in so doing imposes near impenetrable layers of misunderstanding everywhere. Our standard account, as is the case with all standard accounts, exists in the realm of that which is known to be known. This status gives it an air of authenticity, authority, and so no one ever stops to question why it is known to be known, and whether or not that original mode of understanding is valid. Even were one to attempt to do so, they would be faced with untangling this Gordian knot of citation, repetition, memeing. In the Dawkins sense of the meme, these ideas given a life of their own and twisted by the long, slow telephone game of history into something unrecognizable from their original form. As Alexander demonstrated, the fastest way to get to the heart of a Gordian mass of tumorous idea is with a scalpel. The broken Indian model is the indigenous manifestation of the old time-tested technique of blaming the victim, a proven method of obfuscation, avoiding social connotations and consequences. I choose not to play that game. By blaming the imaginary specter of faulty immune systems, Columbus, Cortez, Sullivan, Scott are exonerated for their crimes against humanity. Sure, he conquered Mexico, but almost all of the deaths were from disease, acts of God, unavoidable. It didn't matter that he shot the guy a couple of times first, he was just helping nature take its course. He's a hero, really. An angel of mercy. And the other guy deserved it. Sure, he enslaved the entire population of the Taino and cut off a lot of noses and hands, but we can't blame the extinction of Taino on that. Clearly, they were just doomed to extinction anyway, evolutionarily designed by God to die. And whether they died with their hands or noses attached doesn't make all that much difference in the end. He's a hero, really, because he at least got them to generate some wealth for the Habsburgs before their inevitable demise. Good on him for not compromising and making lemons out of that lemonade. Sure, he burned every village and destroyed millions of bushels of corn and cut down all the fruit trees and drove them into the wilderness just in time for winter, but it's not his fault half of them died. Indians just be like that sometimes. Case in point. Those stubborn, resentful little savages in the residential schools, dying out of spite, just to tarnish the legacy of one of our great poets. No, hard labor beatings and off-brand imitation gruel and sacking the chief medical officer couldn't have had anything to do with it. No. There's no way we could have mitigated things. People had no knowledge of germ theory in the 1920s, and anyway, it was well known that Indians always just drop like flies when brushed by a light breeze. They have notoriously bad immune systems, probably on account of those thrifty genes you're always hearing about. They're just not built for this world. No natural immunity is a particularly excellent and effective branch of the broken Indian model, with this double veneer of pseudo-historicity and objectivity coupled with the respectable French polish of centuries of use and legitimation by known experts. It even has the built-in postern to dodge accusations of racism. I'm just talking about first-wave epidemics here, not race. It's just fact that we've built up stronger immune systems than aborigines on account of our long association with animals. That's not race. It's just basic science. Just basic science that our race is just genetically superior to yours as a result of our long history of living in squalor and filth. That's not racism, that's just fact. You're not one of those anti-fact types, are you? This postern also contributes to the unfalsifiability of the idea. Because phrases like no natural immunity can mean all things to all men, the goalposts for any potential conversation or argument have been put on roller skates. It's all distraction tactics. The emphasis on disease disguises the material conditions that were the real causes of population decline. The four horsemen of the apocalypse is an apt metaphor. War, famine, pestilence, death. Each of these are system shocks, destabilizing forces that feed into one another. It should surprise nobody that when you're at war, it gets harder to produce food. Famine weakens immune systems, exacerbating disease. All three lead to mass death, which is a destabilizing force in itself, feeding back into the other three. Yes, disease was inevitable. It was always going to take between a fifth and a third of the people alive at the time, maybe more in some places. But it didn't need to take more than that. It didn't need to mean long-term population decline. That population decline was the norm is on the colonists and the conquerors. Acts of nature isn't something they should be able to hide behind. No, on balance, I'd say she died of natural causes. Natural causes? Can't live without a spinal column, son. Nothing unnatural about that. Let's give a simile. During the Holocaust, it was actually a minority of deaths that came from gas chambers and Mausers. Most of the people who died in the camps died of disease. Does this in any way exonerate the Nazis? Is there any legitimate individual who seriously argues that it does? Have you ever heard somebody blame these deaths on faulty Jewish immune systems or the thrifty Jewish gene? Does anyone have the sheer audacious dishonesty to pursue that line? And if he did, how long do you think he'd last in polite society before he was torn to shreds, and rightly so? And yet our society tolerates equivalent arguments in reference to indigenous people. Most people won't even see how there could be a problem. That's how deeply ingrained the hyper-real myth of the Indian is. No natural immunity is rhetoric, not science, and very tired rhetoric at that. The danger of the broken Indian model in all of its permutations is this ease by which it presents rhetoric as fact, duping the ill-informed into echoing the specific language without considering where that language comes from in the first place. Who am I to question what is known to be known? Surely if it was false, it wouldn't continue to be repeated. Who am I to question my school history teacher with all of his fancy books and citations and edumacation? I'm just some guy. We forget that even the Gospels were written by just some guy. This dogmatic and uncritical mentality is what allowed Aristotelian elementalism to dominate the medical profession for 2,000 years. Where does the specific language of our standard account come from in the first place? It comes from a place of studious, unwitting ignorance, promulgated by cold, crouching malice. I hope I have demonstrated this. More perniciously, though, than the ways it enforces the deliberate misunderstanding of us by the other, is how, through its sheer pervasive ubiquity, it invites and coerces us to misunderstand ourselves. Quotation. The first explanation blames the victim. The second demands we look for the perpetrator or perpetrators. The first explanation sees it arising from a fickle, irreversible Mother Nature. The second demands deeper explanations to develop real interventions. The first explanation is mystical and unscientific. The second historical and material. The first explanation is racist, the second human. The first explanation encourages the status quo. The second demands radical activity. The first explanation paves over problems with false consciousness. The second option does what? End quotation. Dying to Please You, Indigenous Suicide in Contemporary Canada. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this interesting. That's all for today. Something more fun next time.